What names do you think of when you think of the American Revolutionary War? Probably names like John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington. However, you may not recognize some very important names from that era because they simply didn't teach you about them in school. Names like Benjamin Talmadge, Abraham Woodhull, and Robert Townsend. Daring, brave men who risked their very lives for their country, whose names were lost to history for over a century. Why didn't they get talked about after the war? Why didn't they make appearances in American history books? Well, because they were damn good spies, that's why. As you may know, a famous spy isn't necessarily a good spy. Made evident in our story today, the most successful espionage endeavors usually go by unnoticed.
I'm sure I'm invisible.
Hi, Drax.
That being said, after enough time passed, documentation was unearthed that told a largely unknown story of George Washington's own espionage ring, deeply embedded in the heart of British-held New York during the Revolutionary War. As with all old stories that have gaps in them, imagination and speculation have spawned myth, legend, and even outright fallacies in attempts to tell complete stories of what happened in this spy ring. Today, I will remain as historically accurate as I possibly can and peel off all of the imaginative fluff from the truth as I tell you the story of the Culper Ring. But before we get to that, hi, my name is Brad, and this is the channel for people that love history but fall asleep when trying to read actual history books. If you can relate to that and are interested in historical content made with that in mind, then welcome home to Lest We Forget, the channel about history's best bits told by myself, with my massive beard and my immense charm. So, what say we dive in and see what's what about this elusive Culper Ring that caused so much trouble for the British Empire during the Revolutionary War, shall we? The backstory of the Culper Ring is honestly as interesting as the work they accomplished. The Culper Ring was not George Washington's first intel gathering effort, nor the only one at the time of the Culper Ring's activity from 1778 to 1783. Believe it or not, Washington was actually an effective spy master, organizing multiple espionage activities at a time, as he learned was necessary in previous war efforts from the past. Normally, these were one-off espionage missions, or perhaps a single person on the inside that would be an informant gathering information through different methods, but a fully functional intel-pumping spy ring? This would have made history class a lot more fun. As you might know, the British had taken New York in the Battle of Long Island less than 2 months after the Declaration of Independence was signed, driving Washington and his Continental Army out of New York City, and then out of New York altogether into New Jersey not long after. The British held on to New York for the next 7 years. That part you most likely learned in school if you're watching this in America anyway. The bit you most likely did not hear about in school, however, was that Washington realized he needed to find an aptly low-key fashion with which to regularly receive information about British movements and plans in and around New York City if his army was ever to have any chance of taking on the larger, more established British military. This meant that espionage would be vital to the Americans if they had any hopes of holding on to their independence and winning the war. Before Washington's Culper Ring came Nathaniel Sackett's spy network and Knowlton's Rangers before them. And somewhere in there was a one Hercules Mulligan who was deployed as a spy in his own right. Definitely one of Washington's spies, but he wasn't an official Culper Ring spy, contrary to popular opinion. No. Although he may have helped them on the odd occasion in a joint effort to accomplish a mutually beneficial task. Washington's first attempt at intel acquisition after the British took over New York was with Knowlton's Rangers. Albeit a short-lived endeavor, they were a group of soldiers Washington asked Colonel Thomas Knowlton to put together for reconnaissance missions in New York. The first mission being a solo mission in September of 1776, attempted by volunteer Nathan Hale, made famous by his last words to the British before they hung him.
I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country.
This obviously indicating Hale's talents in espionage were close to none, as he was caught only a few weeks after his mission began and boldly told the British what he was doing to their faces when caught. Washington learned here that passionately outspoken men make poor spies. Famous patriots, perhaps, but poor spies. This was followed up with Sackett's New York spy network. While never caught, they didn't provide any information of real value to Washington, and as a result, Washington ended the endeavor with Sackett not very long after it began. Results apparently being quite important when trying to go full-time in espionage. Who knew? Another spy under Washington, John Clark, a Pennsylvania lawyer who volunteered as a lieutenant in Washington's army in 1775, set up a spy network for Washington on Long Island that operated for most of 1777. However, Clark left the island after this, leaving Washington with little to no espionage activity in the area yet again. This left Washington back at square one. His need to establish a proper espionage network inside New York was growing quickly. If he could not do this, he feared the worst for his Continental Army. But to his surprise, and a welcome one at that, Lieutenant Brewster of Norwalk wrote an unsolicited letter to Washington offering to help gather intel in Long Island. This raised Washington's spirits for sure. Brewster wrote his first intel report to Washington on August 24, 1778. But Washington desperately needed a new spy, or better yet, a network of spies specifically inside New York if he was to stay one step ahead of the British. And it had to work this time. He also needed a military correspondent to work with new volunteer Lieutenant Brewster on Long Island. After giving it a lot of thought, Washington approached Brigadier General Charles Scott about assembling a spy network for him in New York. He assigned a one Benjamin Talmadge, who I mentioned earlier, to assist Scott in developing the spy ring. Brigadier General Scott, being a military-minded man, was not overly enthusiastic about spy work, as it was looked down on at the time as cowardly and could easily result in your death if you were caught. A waste of a good man. So Scott's heart was not in it, and all he could manage to come up with under his own effort were minimal-risk, single-man missions, entering enemy territory, gathering minimal intel from the shadows, and promptly bouncing, which is hardly an effective long-term strategy if you want to be in espionage. This left much of the work of establishing a proper spy network to young Talmadge, who, fortunately, was more enthusiastic about the concept than Scott was. Letters between Talmadge and Abraham Woodhull, a childhood friend of Talmadge's, indicate that his operation was in full swing by October of 1778. With Scott's approval, Talmadge came up with a list of code names for the key players in the organization. From this point on, all communications and documents concealed the identity of the members of the group. Talmadge became John Bolton, and Woodhull became Samuel Culper. What made the Culper Ring special out of all of Washington's attempts at espionage was their effectiveness at acquiring valuable information about British movements and plans. So effective were Talmadge's early espionage efforts that his boss, Brigadier General Charles Scott, chose to step down as leader of Washington's spy network. Washington, seeing Talmadge's early success, then promoted Talmadge to Director of Military Intelligence at the ripe old age of just 24 years. Initially, Woodhull, who owned a farm in the Setauket area of Long Island, made several trips to New York on his own, hoping to gather intel. However, after being detained and questioned repeatedly by British sentries for being somewhat out of place, he determined he needed someone inside the city to gather the intel for him, and then have a courier bring the new intel to him in Setauket. From there, Woodhull could then arrange getting the information to Talmadge. Woodhull went to an old friend whom he could certainly trust. His name was Robert Townsend, a resident of Oyster Bay, New York, who was a low-key Patriot sympathizer. This is one of those spots where we have to kind of pull apart the fiction from the fact, however, as some authors and even historians say Townsend was the co-owner of a Loyalist coffeehouse, along with a man named James Rivington. Also, that Townsend could even have been a volunteer journalist for Rivington's Loyalist newspaper, Rivington's Gazette, using his journalist role to freely ask questions of the Loyalist soldiers without causing any suspicion. While this gives a semi-plausible solution to the question of Townsend's MO in theory, there is apparently no evidence to suggest these claims to actually be true. In fact, historians with a bit of a stronger adhesion to the truth have dug up the real truth on Townsend's story. Townsend was a business owner of his own, whose business simply happened to be located in the same area as Rivington's businesses. Townsend bought paper from Rivington's general store across the street. That is the only official business connection between the two men that can be proven. But it's also not like that's the only place he could gather intel. He could also freely move about New York City in his downtime and get a much better idea of British goings-on firsthand without stirring any suspicion. This making Townsend the perfect man for the job of spying on the British. Woodhull knew he could trust him, and so Townsend was in if he wanted the job. And want the job, he did. Townsend was officially a Culper Ring spy, although he implored Woodhull not to reveal his identity to anyone, including Washington. Although Talmadge did end up knowing who he was at some point, so I guess Woodhull let that one slip. Townsend was going to need a code name, though, as to protect his identity if any of his intel was discovered by the British on its way out of New York. Being that his friend Abraham Woodhull, aka Samuel Culper, had brought him into the group, he took the name Culper Jr., making Woodhull Culper Sr. Now, with Talmadge, Woodhull, and Townsend all in place, they had their network. So, how did they get the intel to and from each other without getting caught or stirring up any suspicion? Alright, so pay attention, this is where it gets a little webby. Here's how it worked. Townsend would figure out valuable intel on British movements and or plans of attack, all stealthy-like. He would then write down the information in code where it was needed. Townsend would then give the message to a trusted courier. Now, this message ultimately needed to get to Washington, who was stationed north of the British-held New York City in northeast New Jersey. However, the roads between British-held New York and the area where Washington's base camp was heavily patrolled by British sentries at many different checkpoints, making this route a big risk for their intel falling into British hands. So, a different route was going to be needed. The route chosen would first take the selected courier east to Setauket, Long Island, where Woodhull lived, instead of north to George Washington. For this task, patriot and childhood friend of Talmadge, Austin Rowe, who owned 2 businesses in the Setauket area, would make regular supply trips to New York for his businesses, and while in New York would retrieve the intel from Townsend and bring it back with him to Setauket. After Rowe would meet Townsend for the handoff, quite possibly hidden in goods purchased from Townsend's store, Rowe would leave New York, heading east, crossing the East River, and making his way back to Setauket on Long Island. A 55-mile trip, one way, on a horse. Anyway, once Rowe had successfully made his way to Setauket, he would give the message to Woodhull, or Culper Sr., and from here, Woodhull needed to have the newly received intel delivered across the Long Island Sound to couriers waiting on the other side in Connecticut. Enter Caleb Brewster. Brewster was a whaleboat captain who grew up alongside Talmadge and Woodhull, and he wanted to help. Brewster knew the Long Island Sound like the back of his hand, and was a patriot ready to risk his life to get these important messages across the Sound through British waters to the anxiously waiting couriers on the other side. Once safely in the hands of the couriers, they took the acquired intel from their meeting with Brewster and booked it to Talmadge, if he didn't meet Brewster himself, of course. Once safely in Talmadge's possession, he would personally take the new intel the rest of the way to Washington, thus eliminating the need to travel the more guarded roads between New York City and Washington's base camp in New Jersey, albeit a significantly longer route that would take more time for the intel to be safely transported. Many have put forward the idea that Woodhull knew which cove Brewster would be landing at because of a one Anna Strong, who notified Woodhull via secret messages hidden on her clothesline, not like under the clothes or in a pocket, but like the actual arrangement of the clothes themselves. Foolproof. The location of the cove Brewster would be waiting at indicated by the number of handkerchiefs hanging on the line, and Brewster's arrival being indicated by a hanging black petticoat on the line. This is an entirely possible situation, although Anna and her coated clothesline are never mentioned in any of the Culper Ring's letters, making Anna's participation in the Culper Ring somewhat controversial. That being said, I did read that some papers were apparently found in the Frank family archives that confirmed the person signaling Woodhull with the time and location of Brewster's arrivals to be none other than the wife of one Judge Strong. So it could very well be the case. The Frank family account being relevant because Woodhull's sister had married into the Frank family, which lived near Woodhull's farm, and could very well have been slipped some form of information. I don't know. I wasn't there. The idea of Anna Strong being the official lady spy of the group, however, came from one letter that was from Woodhull to Talmadge, stating that with the help of a 355, code for lady in the group, acquaintance of his, he would be able to undertake a vaguely explained endeavor and, quote, outwit them all. This one reference has spawned all sorts of fanciful ideas of what that might mean. Outside of this single reference to a lady, however, there was never actually any mention of any lady officially engaging in espionage with the Culper Ring, anywhere in any of the Culper Ring letters over the course of their 5 years of operation. This leaving many historians to believe that the claim of Anna Strong being an actual agent of the Culper Ring, or any woman being actual spies for the group, to be not but folklore. Some very imaginative authors have portrayed Agent 355 as the Culper Ring's honeypot.
With the glasses, honeycombed me.
What does that even mean?
You honeypotted him. It's honeypot.
Used to lure information out of one or more high-ranking men, potentially including a one Major John Andre and even the infamously treacherous Benedict Arnold. But we'll get back to those two in a bit. While the Culper Ring is believed to be responsible, at least in part, for Arnold's betrayal coming to light, unfortunately there is no historical evidence to suggest any women having deviously seduced the intel out of these men. So while it's all very 007 and sexy sounding, unfortunately the truth is a little less glitzy.
Reality is often disappointing.
As the Culper Ring grew, so did their spycraft. Initially starting with the use of code names for key players in the group as a simple identity protection, and progressing to a more advanced numerical code system developed by Woodhull not long after. Additional names, places, and physical items eventually making their way into the codebook, adding up to 710 different numerical codes when it was all said and done. This made their messages pretty much impossible to decipher without the proper codebook. But even if the enemy can't decipher your numerical code, it is still usually an obviously coded message. And if caught with a coded message, one could be tried for espionage, if not in a military uniform at the time of being caught. This meant that the Culper Ring needed to find more sophisticated methods of concealing the precious intel being taken in and out of the area for their own sake. But it would take time. Luckily, a breath of fresh air and hope would come to the group with the promise of invisible ink. In the summer of 1778, James J., an amateur chemist, had perfected his method of creating invisible ink and informed Washington of its existence. The prospect of being able to give his spy ring invisible ink was exciting to Washington. While it was not James J.'s own invention as a concept, J's invisible ink was much harder to reveal than the commonly used methods at the time. The only problem was that Jay's situation made it difficult to create large quantities of the ink quickly. It would be 6 months after Washington learned of Jay's invisible ink and employed him to make it for the Culper Ring's use before the first batch was delivered to Washington. You'd think it would be put right to use, but it was not a large enough amount to actually give the agents of the Culper Ring, and it would take an additional 6 months to pass before a second batch was delivered in April of 1779, finally giving Washington the amount needed to distribute amongst his spy ring. This forced the Culper Ring to rely on coded messages
for an entire year.
Anxiety would have been really high during that time when you were carrying vital intel in your pocket and it was obviously a coded message. Luckily for the men of the Culper Ring, the invisible ink came at the perfect time, as they had recently had some of their coded letters fall into the British hands when one of their unnamed couriers was caught with them on his person, leaving the British on the lookout for other coded messages. The British were also vaguely aware that someone was going a longer way around the commonly used path to get from where they were in New York to where Washington was. It was much more common to have a blank piece of parchment on you back then as opposed to a visible message bearing the use of code. So for the truly important messages, they could rest easy, knowing that their intel was expertly concealed with the invisible ink of James J's. Although they had to be sparing with the ink that they had and still needed to use coded messages for less important messages. Washington urged the secrecy of this invisible ink be kept at the highest level because he didn't want anyone being able to decipher how James J's particular version of this invisible ink was exposed. Heat would not expose its hidden message, as was the case for known methods of exposing invisible ink at the time. A specific solution was needed for this ink that only James J. and his brother John knew the recipe for. Keeping this fact a secret was of utmost importance. So, while they didn't have ejector seats and oil slicks on their horses or hidden cameras in their powdered wigs, they had some pretty awesome spycraft for the time, and it helped them go on to safely send intelligence to Washington until the British evacuated New York for good. Things in the spy ring were going quite well until they simply went silent in 1780. Well, let's look at what was going on during their silence, namely the famous story of the American traitor who almost cost America the entire revolution. A man who I mentioned earlier being Benedict Arnold. While you may have heard about Benedict Arnold, you almost certainly never heard that Arnold was on the Culper Ring's radar, or Revolutionary War era location system. Eyes, I guess. Anyway, in mid to late 1780, Major General Benedict Arnold had set a plan in motion to hand over the American fort of West Point to the British. West Point only recently having been put in Arnold's charge at all, so why would Arnold do such an awful thing? Well, the short story is that Arnold wasn't always a British loyalist at heart. Not long before this time, in 1775 and 1776, Arnold was a wealthy merchant businessman in the colonies and an officer in Washington's army. He sunk his entire fortune into building the American military some ships with which to escape the British at the time. Expecting to be compensated for this generous act, Arnold requested that Congress repay him. Unfortunately for Arnold, they rejected his request not once, but multiple times on the basis that he had lost the receipts for the expenses in battle and couldn't prove the requested amount as a result. Congress even going as far as to withhold his military pay as they actually believed he owed them money. Years later, however, the very receipts in question were found in Canadian archives, most likely taken there by the British at some point during the Revolutionary War. Ironically, he had been very detailed in his record keeping and was being 100% honest about his expenses when he requested compensation. Turns out, he was never trying to take advantage of the American government and was being passively aggressively accused, if not aggressively accused, of doing just that. A ridiculous set of actions that almost cost America the Revolutionary War altogether. Typical Congress, letting the country burn before they loosen their grip on the dollar. After being left in financial ruin, essentially, and finally accepting that he would not ever be compensated by the American government for his great financial loss, Arnold made a decision to forget his loyalties and struck a deal with the British to hand over command of West Point willingly. Arnold was a proud man, however, and he strung out negotiations with the British, trying to get what he thought his betrayal was worth. Hoping to regain his losses and secure his future in a British America, he demanded £20,000 for his betrayal. This brings us to John Andre. Andre was the talk of the town in New York, a British major who came from nothing to the great admiration from his nation in a matter of just a few years. Under his own merit, Andre became fluent in many languages, could win over the respect of a man or the heart of a woman with ease. He was charming, attractive, and self-made, and he was loved and respected by the British. Andre was the ideal British officer. Andre handled the aforementioned negotiations that occurred with Arnold, and when it came time for the plot to go down, the first step was for Arnold to make good on his promise of intel of West Point's layout. And so, in September of 1780, a meeting was set. Arnold was prepared to hand over maps of West Point, which was now vulnerable, as he had not improved the fortifications as per Washington's request, but in fact had downgraded them, or let them fall into ruin in some cases instead. Andre was going to reveal the locations of Washington and the various American forces in the area. This would have been devastating to the American war effort and quite possibly could have given the British victory overall. General Henry Clinton, now Commander-in-Chief of the British military in North America, sent Andre to meet with Arnold just over the American line and personally acquire the maps and locations from him. Clinton had specifically told Andre not to leave the ship, not to be in plain clothes, and not to have any of the documents acquired from Andre on his person at any time. Clinton didn't want Andre being confused with a spy by the Americans. Spies meant nasty ends at the end of a noose in those times, tried as a spy and given a death without honor, just as Nathan Hale had. And he couldn't have one of his best men getting caught up in a kerfuffle like that now, could he? Perish the thought. Well, for whatever reason, Andre busted out and did all three of those things. He started strong, staying in uniform, he was on the boat, he was doing good. But for whatever reason, the meet with Arnold didn't go down on the first attempt, and it had to be rescheduled. The original plan was now being deviated from, and Andre was beginning to lose his cool, collected demeanor. He didn't want to be busted for espionage, he liked his life. But he panicked. Probably when the second meet happened not on or even near the boat, but inland, deeper behind American lines. He managed to successfully meet with Arnold this time and secure the intel, but then that's when things went bad for Andre. Upon returning to the area where the boat had been previously, Andre discovered that there was now no boat. It is unclear what happened to the boat exactly. Some say it was destroyed by a passing group of militia, and some that it left upon seeing the militia group approaching.
Is that it there?
Yes, there it is. Why is it there?
Either way, Andre had now set out back towards British territory on foot, and rather than destroying the documents he had acquired from Arnold like he was told to do, he decided to put them in his boot. Not exactly an original idea there, John, but then Andre pulled his biggest blunder of all. He took off his British military uniform and adorned plainclothes to avoid detection, going on under an alias with documentation that bared Arnold's signature. Now, with sensitive American military information in his boot, dressed as a civvy with falsified identification in his pocket, hoofing it across American territory, Andre was really living life on the edge. He even managed to get past one militia group without blowing his cover, only to be apprehended and strip-searched by a passing trio of 3 armed militia who stopped him later on. At which time they discovered the concealed intel and handed him over to the nearest military outpost. Once there, a letter was sent to Washington to alert him of the captured spy and the documents found on him. Then Andre was foolishly sent to Arnold by the folks down at this military outpost instead of keeping him there a prisoner. Once Talmadge got wind of this, he insisted that Andre be brought back immediately so that he could be interrogated, thus narrowly avoiding Andre and Arnold conveniently escaping together. When Washington finally received the letter about the mysterious spy and the accompanying documentation found on him, he noticed whose handwriting was in those documents, and his heart sank. Washington broke down and cried at them. After a few moments of bereavement, Washington composed himself and sent for Arnold, who he was told would be back in an hour's time when he had first arrived in West Point, and asked where Arnold was. But Arnold had escaped just before Washington's arrival, as the letter was sent to West Point, where Washington was expected to be, giving Arnold, the traitor, the opportunity to read it first and bounce. Washington had Andre, though, and even tried to use him as leverage to make a trade for Arnold, but to no avail. Clinton refused the exchange, even though he very much wanted to see Andre returned. As a result, a military trial was held to determine Andre's fate. Unfortunately for Andre, his worst fear was now a reality, and he was convicted of partaking in espionage activity. Not long afterwards, John Andre was hung as a spy, begging in the few days leading up to his hanging to be spared such a dishonorable death, and instead to be given death by firing squad. His pleas were denied, however, by Washington, and he was given the spy's death, left hanging in silence for a half hour before being brought down and placed in a shallow, unmarked grave. The British were outraged. This brings us back to the Culper Ring. Where the heck were they during all of this, and did they play any part of it? Well, they were keeping all of their activity pretty low-key during this time, having gone silent in their communications with Washington for some time now. So it gets a little bit hazy in this part of the story. Not long before the meet with Andre and Arnold, the Culper Ring had discovered that one of America's generals was likely in bed with the British. They were likely doing all they could to determine the identity of that traitor and prevent him from accomplishing his treacherous goal. That was their entire mission, was to keep America safe and continuing. Albeit hard to determine all of the facts in this story in some cases, there simply aren't definite answers. This being one of those. Officially, 3 passing militia simply happened upon Andre, at which time Andre apparently just blabbed that he was a British officer, leading the men to strip search him then and there, discovering the hidden intel and saving West Point from British takeover. Although some believe the 3 men who captured Andre were actually Culper Ring spies who knew exactly where Andre was and bumped into him on purpose. thus accomplishing their mission of preventing the American traitor from succeeding in his betrayal. I personally believe this to be the case, just from my own research, the solidifying detail for me being that in Talmadge's memoirs, he actually admitted to leaving out some of the details of Andre's capture in his official report. This begs the question, what information would Talmadge of all people possibly be keeping secret in this situation? In my personal opinion, Talmadge was likely omitting their assistance from the record to preserve their secret identity, allowing them to continue on with their efforts in espionage. And the three men who officially discovered Andre's secret were simply there to give the public someone to praise for the heroic deed of discovering the plot to hand over West Point. There are not enough definite facts to say for sure though, so I guess we'll never officially know. Once Arnold successfully made his way to New York, the Culper Ring bounced out of town for weeks, most likely expecting him to reveal knowledge of the espionage activity occurring in New York. But after a few weeks, when nothing had come of it, they returned and began to resume their spy activities, albeit somewhat anxiously. Unfortunately, some of the Culper Ring members were arrested and imprisoned by the British around this time. Not enough to blow the whole operation, but enough to slow them down considerably, which is why I believe we don't hear much about them in 1782 and 3. One of the people who was arrested was apparently a valuable person in the group that had done a lot of work for them. It does not mention who that person is, but it is someone very important to Robert Townsend, as once this news met his ears, he was never the same man again, being reduced to alcoholism and severe depression for the remainder of his days. Some say it was Anna Strong, and that Townsend had been having an affair with her, breaking his heart upon learning of his mistress' capture. But again, that's fairy tale stuff, and there's no documentation to prove this idea. In the last couple years of the Culper Ring's existence, they continued to help Washington acquire intel on British activity. However, there's just, like I said, not much historical evidence to know what all they accomplished during this time. The previous years had put a strain on Woodhull's health and other members of the groups as well, and with Townsend being a shell of his former self, the last years of the Culper Ring were less exciting than the first few, to say the least. They had accomplished so much, but it came at quite a cost and with no praise or acknowledgement for any of their efforts. After the largely undocumented final 2 years of the Culper Ring's existence and the Battle of Yorktown was over, the Americans had secured victory of the war over the British, and the Culper Spy Ring was disbanded. The remaining members fell back into civilian life as if nothing had ever happened, most of their family members never even knowing they had been one of Washington's most valuable spies in the first place. There are other bits and pieces of this story that I didn't put into my telling of it, as they were not pivotal details to the main story, but not much was left out, to be honest. There was really not a plethora of detailed stories about the Culper Ring out there, which does make them the most successful espionage effort of Washington's during the Revolutionary War. Because good spies aren't famous. If you enjoyed watching this video and are interested in watching more like it, then please hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video. It would be immensely appreciated. And don't forget, you saw it here on Lest We Forget.